So thank you again. Hopefully you're in the right one. We are looking at teaching Buddhism. You will have got a message off me yesterday because I had a crisis of confidence. I have those periodically, essentially because I recognize that Buddhism is such a huge thing. With my students at university, we spend about a day exploring Buddhism, and even that's not long enough. And so if we spend 60 minutes to an hour, well, 60 minutes to 90 minutes talking about Buddhism, we're never going to be able to cover everything. But hopefully this will kind of whet your appetite and help you begin to plan, or will consolidate the things that you have already done. It's nice to see some people here who've been on some of the previous CPDs. There are some people here who I'm currently teaching and some who I've taught in the past as well. So it's nice to see all of you. If I can just introduce myself for those of you that don't know me or haven't been on a CPD before. My name's James Holt. I'm Associate Professor of Religious Education at the University of Chester. My role there is mainly on the RE PGCE for secondary teachers, and so that's most of my day job that I spend doing. But I also spend some time teaching those who are on primary courses, whether they're doing a PGCE primary or a BA undergraduate primary. Sorry, before working at Chester, I was a teacher in secondary schools for 13 years. Yep, and I filled lots of different roles within that, but my main role was teaching religious education. And I was also an AST or advisory teacher for RE within Manchester, supporting primary and secondary schools. So that's my background. So the stuff that I'm talking about is based on some research that I've done, but also with regards to the actual classroom practice that I've done as well. Those are my contact details, my email, my website, and my Twitter handle. Please feel free to follow and have a look around the website. There's a few eclectic different things. I think I write about American football, I write about religious stuff, and then I write about religious education as well. So there's all kinds of things going on in there. The couple of books I mentioned before, one is particularly pertinent to today, and that's the one on the left, which is Religious Education in the Secondary School. The first half of the book explores kind of the pedagogy and how you would go about teaching RE. And the second half of the book is a chapter on the biggest 6 religions. And one of those chapters is about Buddhism. So some of the things that we talk about today will come from there. Okay, so if we make a start just by looking at kind of the statistics to do with Buddhism. In 2011 census, which are the most up-to-date census figures that we have, there were nearly 250,000 Buddhists in England and Wales. And those are people who identified themselves as Buddhist. There was no particular, there's nothing beyond what religion are you, and Buddhism was one of the answers that was available. You will notice looking at the map that was done by, I think it was by Pew, and their research center, there are nearly 500 million in the Asian Pacific area of the country, of the world even, with regards to Buddhists, and then a smattering throughout the rest of the world. But I think with 250,000 within the country, I think it is important that we do explore Buddhism as a part of our teaching at the various different key stages. But I think, and this is a huge generalization, so I do apologize for this. It may not apply to you. But I think in the main, the Buddhism that we teach isn't necessarily the Buddhism that is experienced by most people. And if you've attended a seminar with me before, you'll notice that I use this image quite a lot, because Buddhism is messy. And what we try and do when we teach is we try and neatly package it so it makes sense for the people that we're teaching, for the children that we're teaching, but I think most especially so it makes sense in our mind. It kind of fits the paradigms that we're expecting religions to fit into. And Buddhism is one of those religions that is very messy, and it's messy for a couple of reasons. The first one is that it challenges what we mean by religion. So this first statement, Buddhism cannot, and this is by Mathera, Buddhism cannot therefore be strictly called a religion because it's neither a system of faith and worship, nor the outward act or form by which men, sorry about that word, indicate their recognition of the existence of a god or gods having power over their own destiny, to whom obedience, service, and honor are due. Now, I think there's even a problem with that statement, because although the vast majority, a large number of Buddhists are atheistic in their approach to life and the way that they live their lives, there are a large number of Buddhists who will talk about the existence of gods. Not necessarily the Judeo-Christian God, and in that same manner that perhaps Jews, Christians, and Muslims would talk about God, but there is talk about gods and everything else. But if we teach a sanitized view, which is everybody kind of believes the same, then this is the kind of thing that we teach. But it's a religion, for the most part, without a God. And then he carries on. If by religion is meant a teaching which takes a view of life that is more than superficial, a teaching that looks into life and not merely at it, a teaching which furnishes people with a guide to conduct that is in accord with its inlook, a teaching which enables those who give it heed to face life with fortitude and death with serenity, then it's certainly a religion of religions. So there's two different views. And whenever I talk to Buddhists, they would perhaps have the conversation with me that theirs is not a religion, but it is a way of life. But I think that's the same conversation I have with anyone who follows any religion, is it's not just the structure, it is the way that people live their lives. And so I think we treat it as such, but I think we do need to be just very cautious. And I think we can use it in a way to challenge both what we think a religion nicely fits into, but also the way that children might see a religion as a whole as well. But we also have to recognize the messiness of religion, not in terms of Buddhism, not just in terms of the way that whether it is a religion or not, it's about the idea of what Buddhism is. And I think when we teach Buddhism, to some extent, we teach a synthesized, is that the right word, or a syncretic view of Buddhism. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But essentially, we teach a chocolate box view. So the things that children can best understand. And this is whether we're teaching at Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 3, potentially at Key Stage 4 and 5 as well, though hopefully there is a little bit more diversity there. And I have mentioned this before in different CPDs, but Jonathan Smith has suggested that religion is not a native character. It's not a first-person characterization. It's not something that people set out to put together. It was just a system that has been imposed on others. And so Buddhism is a religion. It meets certain of the criteria, but it does challenge the way that we view that. But at the same time, it doesn't come neatly packaged. Not all Buddhists do the same thing. Not all Buddhists believe the same thing. And sometimes when we teach, we do this syncretic view. And this syncretic view would show all Buddhists perhaps looking like this, but also if we view Buddhism as this elephant, and I know I've used this in other CPDs, but it's something that I use quite regularly. In a conversation with a friend the other week, when he saw this, he suggested that this is beloved of all liberal RE teachers. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. Well, I do, and I'll go on to discuss that. Can I just pause a moment? Across the road from where I'm now talking to you, there is someone digging up the road. Is there really bad sound coming through? Or can you hear me okay? Could you mention on chat? Okay, fab. Meg says I'm good. Thank you. It's just me that can hear it then, and it's annoying. Okay. So normally when this image is used by some people in training, what they say is that religion as a whole is this elephant. And so therefore, when we look at the various parts of the elephant, we're looking, I don't know, Buddhism being number 1, Christianity being number 2, Hinduism being number 3, and so on. And so what they're saying is they're all just looking at the same part. And this is quite like John Hick's view of the real, really, is that we're just looking at different parts of things, but we all get there in the end. But actually, I think a far better interpretation, because I think that's wrong, to be honest, but I think a far better interpretation of this is the idea that, well, actually, this elephant is Buddhism, And different people have different experiences of Buddhism, and us as a teacher, we can only teach kind of the fuzzy outline, and there will be things that we miss. And so that's why when we teach, we use many, most, and some when we talk about Buddhism. And that's really important, whether we're teaching early years foundation stage or whether we're teaching Key Stage 5, the many, most, and some approach to RE in the way that we talk about things is key. Now, having said that, there are some things that I'm going to explore today that highlight almost the central core of Buddhism, and then there's also other things that kind of fit around the periphery of the various things. So there are three main schools of Buddhism, and apologies if this is something that you already know lots about. So there's the Hinayana Nikaya school of Buddhism, and to be honest, the only surviving form of that is Theravada. And it's the oldest form, and if we accept the idea of the three vehicles, and Theravadins generally wouldn't, then this is also known as the common vehicle. Sometimes it's known as the lesser vehicle as well. But it has about 150 million adherents around the world. This is according to Peter Harvey, who's a scholar of Buddhism. There's Mahayana. This is a later development, but it is by far the largest school of Buddhism with, and I just have to move something out of the way, 360 million Buddhists around the world that would consider themselves Mahayana. Now, there is the idea of the diamond vehicle, the Vajrayana. But, for example, it might include Tibetan, and a number of Tibetan Buddhists would also recognize themselves as Mahayana. So Vajrayana is almost a subset of Mahayana. It would also include Mahayana, Zen, and Pure Land. And then there are smaller groups. One of the most prominent within Britain is Triratna, who used to be the Western Buddhist order. And they are found sometimes on the GCSE specifications, sometimes on the A-level specifications as well. But Triratna, when I started teaching, they had a charitable arm called Clear Vision, who provided a lot of the materials that I used to use in schools, and I think they're still around today. So, for example, the Buddhist centre that you would find in Manchester or London would tend to be the Western Buddhist order. But it is not really any of the three that are above. There's Navayana, and I think it's Sattva within there as well. So there's and there's lots of others. And I think when we teach Buddhism, so there's a question about where does Godampa fit in, and I think it fits in within Mahayana as a part of that, and possibly within Vajrayana as well. So there's all kinds of schools, and in fact, it's quite interesting. There's a student that I'm teaching this year that used to follow Godampa, and her view of Buddhism is very different to the view of Buddhism that we teach within schools. And so it's interesting to see just the diversity that is there, and that has actually challenged me this year to kind of explore where Buddhism lies and what it is I understand about Buddhism. I think sometimes what we do when we teach is we teach aspects of Theravada and we teach aspects of Mahayana, but we don't identify them as such. We kind of jump from one to the other, and it almost becomes the syncretic view of what Buddhism is. And if I use a further example, and sorry to use a Christian example at this point, but when we teach the Nativity story, we have Matthew's version, which I think is the one with the wise men, and then we have Luke's version, where we have the shepherds. And what we do is we kind of do a composite. So we put both of those things together. And I think to some extent, that's what we do with, without kind of acknowledging that there's two separate stories going on. And maybe it's just the way I've taught it, or maybe it's just the way I've seen it being taught. But we tend to take aspects of Theravada, teach it as though it's Buddhism. And then we take aspects of Mahayana and teach it as though it's Buddhism. And I have no issue with that, but we kind of don't recognize that there are different traditions that emphasize certain things. And I will use a couple of examples from that later on in this. So this is just an example of something that is potentially possible to use, possibly later Key Stage 2. certainly Key Stage 3, where we have the 3 different forms, and then as you can see on this diagram, the things in the middle is shared by all of them. The things in the jaggedy boxes that join 2 of them are things that are shared by 2 of them, and then the bubbles are to do with the unique aspects. Now, I have done that at different key stages, but with regards to Buddhism, I've only ever done that at Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 3, possibly Key Stage 4 as well. So this is just something that I put in to show you as an idea of something that we can do. When I've used it within Key Stage 1, it's more, and early years foundation stage, it's more been something that we've done on the floor, and we've kind of had the different festivals that are within each one, and kind of children have to put things where they belong. But that's just an idea that I put in following the 3 different forms. And sometimes when we teach about Buddhism, the focus obviously, and we will explore this later, is on Buddha Gautama or Siddhartha Gautama. So we have on the left-hand side a statue of him. But then it can begin to confuse, because the other 5 images are of bodhisattvas, who are known by some as a shorthand as a Buddha. And so therefore, there can be confusion if we don't recognize the diversity within Buddhism as a whole, and we'll come back to Bodhisattva later. And when I was teaching, I remember at a parents' evening, I was trying to organize a visit to a local Buddhist vihara. And I knew that a member of my form, a member of my class, was a Buddhist or came from a Buddhist family. So I spoke to his parents at parents' evening and said, look, we're trying to organize a trip to the local Buddhist vihara. Do you have any contacts? And she looked, the mother looked very disparagingly at me and basically told me that this group of Buddhists were Western sellouts, and so we should not visit them. And I think up until that point, I'd been teaching maybe 1 or 2 years, I just thought Buddhists were generally the same. But she didn't recognize the classroom Buddhism that I was perhaps suggesting to her. And so this is where the lived reality and the messiness of Buddhism kind of comes in for us, because we have to actually just think, where on earth and how on earth are we going to teach this messiness? And if we're teaching in a primary school, then often the messiness is just recognizing that we're not just teaching that one truth, but there's lots of different ways of experiencing Buddhism as well. So what is the message of Buddhism? Okay, so that kind of laid the groundwork a little bit for just the messiness of stuff. So the message of Buddhism kind of follows the idea of a well-known Indian medical formula to establish the 4 Noble Truths. If you attended my Bridges to Learning CPD, you'll know that one of the bridges is with regards to beliefs and practices. And I think it's really important to understand the concepts of the 4 Noble Truths in order to understand the Buddhist view of life. And so that's why I'm beginning today with the concepts of the 4 Noble Truths. So I've split the 4 Noble Truths into that medical formula. So what's the illness? And so the first Noble Truth is that suffering is a part of everyday life. So suffering is that illness. Now this is something that is quite challenging to teach, because one of the other aspects that we explore is to do with the concepts, and we begin with concepts that are within the children's own experiences. And so if we're exploring the concept of suffering, which is a concept that Buddhists seek to answer, and we're trying to explore the concept of suffering within children's lives, then it's problematic. And so we may have to use not things that are within their own experience, but things that they have seen within the world, and the idea of change and all of those kinds of things. So the second Noble Truth is the cause of this illness, the cause of suffering. And this is the idea that there's craving or desire, so, or attachment. So we are always going to suffer if we have an attachment to something, if we crave something. So one of the things that is causing suffering at the moment for some people is the lack of social contact, because they are social people and because they have friends who they want to be with. So it's to do with a desire or a craving, and it's not there anymore. So does a cure exist? Well, the answer is yes, it does, and it can be ended by stopping desires and cravings. And then the remedy is the fourth noble truth of the middle way. So those are the things that provide the structure for us. So we use those as the basis. And I think whether we're teaching Key Stage 1 or Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4, the Four Noble Truths need to be somewhere, because the other things surrounding Buddhism don't make sense unless we're exploring the Four Noble Truths and the idea of escaping suffering. And Buddhism as a religion is something that has flourished in the West, possibly because it is countercultural. It's against materialism. It's against the idea of craving, generally speaking. And so we kind of explore that type of approach. And so key to all of this, and I think a parable that it's not just a parable. For Buddhists, it's a real story. But the story of the life of the Buddha provides a parable of the Four Noble Truths. And so I think that's why, possibly, compared to any other religion apart from Christianity, Buddhism focuses around the life experiences of its, for want of a better word, founder. So when we teach Islam, there are beliefs and there are practices that are focused purely on God. And within Hinduism, obviously, there's no founder. But everything in some way within Buddhism links back to the life of the Buddha. And amongst all of the different schools of Buddhism, the unifying factor, though with different emphases and everything else, is the life of the Buddha. And so it's really important that we do explore the life of the Buddha at all the different key stages, or at least make reference to it when we're talking about the things that take place. And so we're going to go through briefly these 6 sections of his life. His early life, the 4 sites, his life as an ascetic, the Bodhi tree, the founding of the Sangha, and then his death and parinibbana. Now, just as an aside, you will notice that some of the spellings that I'm using for certain things will be unfamiliar. So, for example, when you look at parinibbana, you may have seen it as a parinirvana. And just as an aside, there are 2 appropriate kind of spelling or transliteration methods. One is from Sanskrit and one is from Pali. Both are acceptable within the concept of Buddhism. I've chosen to use Pali because I also teach Hinduism. And so it's actually a nice delineator between the two. So when I'm talking about karma, K-A-M-M-A, people I'm teaching know I'm talking about Buddhism. When I use K-A-R-M-A, which is the Sanskrit transliteration, they know I'm talking about Hinduism. So it's a small thing, but you may notice some words that are transliterated slightly differently. Okay, moving on. So Siddhartha Gautama was born in Nepal in the 7th century BCE. And most of you will be aware, I think, of the auspicious signs that attended both the pregnancy of his mother and also his birth. So both the dream of the white elephant and also the visit of the holy man, that he suggested that Siddhartha would either be a great king, a great prince, or a great teacher. And so the story goes that he was given and he was provided with every luxury so that he would experience no suffering. There's even a legend or a tradition that the flowers were dug up before their time so that it never happened. So he had been allowed out at different points. And actually, one of the things that we miss, because this we kind of gloss over and say, okay, this is the wealthy part, the luxurious time of Siddhartha's life, is there were things that he experienced that were incredibly positive and laid a basis for things that would come later. So as a young teenager, he did actually leave the palace, or that's the suggestion, but it's not something we particularly talk about very often. So we're going to watch a clip from a BBC documentary about the life of the Buddha and an experience that he has in his early life that has a huge impact on him in his search. Sometimes we teach a sanitized view of kind of his life, and then it's a bit more messy than perhaps we tell in storybooks. And so then we move on to the 4 sights, and these are obviously, and one of the old GCSE questions that people used to love was the 4 sights is the beginning of Buddhism, but it begins his search. It's when he realizes for certain that there is a problem with the world, and that the problem is dukkha, or suffering. And so it marks his decision to search for truth and to search for a solution, because he sees 4 people, and an old man, an ill person, a dead person, and an ascetic. And each of them raise questions for him after he sneaked out of the palace. And so we can look at those, and maybe it's symbolic of all Buddhists at some point, where they begin to realize that there is a problem with life that needs to be solved, and that there is suffering. And so then we move into the period of life where he lives as an ascetic, and you will see Buddha Rupas, which is similar to this one, that are quite, I think, shocking. But they show his emaciated form from when he lived as an ascetic. And it's said that he lived on perhaps a grain of rice a day. And he joined with a group of holy men, and he tried to find the release from suffering within that context. And he was unable to. And so he realized that this life of denial, nor the life of luxury that he had experienced as a child and a teenager, neither provided the way. So there needed to be a middle way. And so we can then see why really the Buddha's life, as well as being for Buddhists accurate, is also a parable, is also something that we look through, and we can explore the truths of Buddhism through it. And so we can look at those different aspects. And his life as an ascetic is important for Buddhists because it shows that neither too much luxury or too much or too little is enough to find happiness. So we then move on to his search for enlightenment underneath the Bodhi tree. And again, this provides an important message within Buddhism, that this isn't just the Buddha's story, but this is a Buddhist's story as well. And so I'm going to share another clip from that same video, and Lisa's very kindly put the link on the chat that shows the whole of the documentary. And I think that's really useful for you to look at within. And so Sophie's asked a question. I'm new to Buddhism. I wondered how you would describe Buddhist monks' lifestyles nowadays. Would they aim for the middle way like Siddhartha, or an ascetic? So I think it's the middle way, and we'll explore that a little bit more in greater detail later on what that middle way looks like. Now, this video is, I think, about 5 minutes long, so I do apologize for showing this much, but I think it's really important because it shows both the importance of the middle way in the search for enlightenment and in the Buddha's final enlightenment itself. And it says it far better than I ever could. So again, I'll show you. There are some very interesting questions that came through this. So one of the questions is to do with, could we compare the middle way and Aristotle's golden mean? I think very much so, because there are similarities, there may be differences as well. But essentially you will see from the video that we've just watched that the middle way is between hedonism and asceticism, and maybe perhaps piety as well, and extreme piety, and that there's not just about the avoidance, but or letting oneself go. It's about just not giving into one's, I suppose, desires, whichever way that might be. And aversion can also be seen to be a part of a desire. Now, interesting, one of the questions, well, someone suggested a book, which is great. Thank you for that. So the other question is, so when Buddhists speak of Mara, they're speaking purely of internal psychological influences as opposed to a physical demon? The answer to that is yes and no. So there will be many Buddhists who will see Mara as a specific demon type person. But I think it's very interesting to look at it from an internal psychological influence where people are perhaps tempted from within themselves, and it's overcoming one's own tendencies for either excess or asceticism. And so it is very interesting to look at those things. What does it mean when it says desire is death and death is desire? I don't know, it sounds very good, but if anyone else has any insights on this, I think the idea is that, yeah, I don't know, kind of the idea that he was suggesting there. But I think perhaps one is, you can't use the phrase spiritual death within Buddhism because there is no spirit, but it's just the idea that one kind of suffers through death, but one also suffers through desires as well. So it's interesting to see both the literal interpretation of the daughters of Mara, for example, dancing for him, but also the idea that it could possibly be a psychological thing within people. And so the idea, that I've forgotten where I was going. The idea that enlightenment is the answer to this, and enlightenment is possible if we live the middle way. Lisa's just said, I'm so glad you don't know the answer to that, because my A-level students asked that question. Yeah, it's just, I've done exactly what you said. I fumbled through it and then I don't really know. I did meet him once and I should have actually asked him the question when I met him. And so then we move from the enlightenment, and this is one of, or the experience with under the Bodhi tree, is the idea that it's not enough to have that knowledge for oneself. It is the idea that the Buddha felt the need to share that. And so he went to those people who he had been an ascetic with, and he actually lived with them and established the first Sangha. So this is his first sermon at the deer park in, I think it's Sarnath. Now, interestingly, when it was first established, the Sangha was limited to monks. And you can see on there, after 5 years, it was extended to include nuns or bhikkhunis at the request of the Buddha's aunt. Now, that actually took a lot of convincing for the Buddha, but from almost the very get-go, it was possible for there to be nuns within the Buddhist Sangha or the Buddhist community. So the Sangha initially, and this is the way that Theravadan Buddhists would understand this, is the Sangha is to do with the ordained Buddhists, the monks and the nuns, and the non-ordained, the laity, and there is a split between those. There is still that split within Mahayana, but in some other forms it's less concrete. And so over the years, the members of the first Sangha and those who followed would have written down his teachings or the Dharma. And so something that I don't talk about today are the three jewels, which are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Well, now I'm talking about them. And so the Dharma is his teaching, and the Sangha is the community of Buddhists from which people find strength. And then the final aspect is the Buddha's death and parinibbana, because enlightenment is not complete, is not final until one has left this earth, until someone has died. And it's then that you receive parinibbana and not just enlightenment as a whole. So it's about those types of things. Now, some Mahayana Buddhists would suggest that he wasn't really ill, but merely teaching people about suffering and impermanence of life. And so everyone has a time where they are to die, but that he wasn't really ill and it just happened. There are other stories associated with the Buddha's death where he choked on a piece of meat. Now that's really interesting, because obviously the first of the 5 precepts within Theravadan Buddhism is to not cause harm to any living thing. And so when we look at that, you think, well, okay, but the Buddha was eating meat. And so it just raises interesting questions and helps us understand again the messiness. But I think with all of the things that we've spoken about so far, the life of the Buddha and his death are incredibly important because they do teach the important truths of impermanence, of the middle way, of the Four Noble Truths. And so whether I'm teaching Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, or Key Stage 3, I would always include aspects of the Buddha's life. Now, within a Key Stage 1 class, I just want them to know the story potentially and perhaps begin to suggest some meaning to it. But then when we move into Key Stage 2, we begin to look at aspects of the Buddha's life and how, therefore, that finds application in the life of a Buddhist today. And then in Key Stage 3, we can look at the variety of ways that it impacts Buddhists' lives with regards. So it's again looking at the skills, it's using the same information as kind of the central aspect of everything that we do. Okay, I'll just show while people think of questions if they want to write any in. This is just a very easy planning sheet for when people are researching and different things surrounding the life of the Buddha, and a fortune line, which is just a different way of students engaging with the story and creating a line graph as to how the Buddha would have felt. And I would then ask them to use different words to replace the ones that are on the left. So there's various different things that we can do either as a class or as individuals to explore the life of the Buddha. And obviously there's always cartoon strips and drama. One of the ways of using drama that I've come across in the last 10 or so years is something called process drama. Now, the way I used to use drama is everybody act out a certain part of the Buddha's life, and then I watch the same events 10 times and get really bored. And it's like, well, what am I learning and what are the children learning from doing this? So process drama is something where the drama unfolds. So you tell the story, you as the teacher are the narrator of the story, and then you have children provide a freeze frame. And they act out a certain part, and then you say stop, and they stop. So you've got 8 different groups perhaps doing that. And then it's hot seating the different characters. So how are you feeling at this point? What's going through your mind? And so talking to your drama department about the use of process drama within this is quite important. But children can either come up with those things for themselves or the events for themselves, or you can give them. Now, the benefit of the fortune line is that we can do this with regards to almost any story. So this is one I use with Rama and Sita as well. But what I would do here, and so we would look at, for example, in a different color, Sita's view of things as well. And so we could compare the experiences of the various different people. Right, there's a couple of questions. How do you start teaching the story of his life to not be retelling or describing it? And someone suggests influence the impact of his life for story for Buddhists today. And I think that's the key thing. We quickly go through the story and we remind students of that, of pupils of that story, but then we want pupils to understand what's actually going on and why it's important for Buddhists today, how it's reflected in the life of a Buddhist today, and all of those other things that are there. So yes, so thank you, Kelly, for that. And one of the things that we need to look at within the things that we do is the skills that we want students to be able to develop, because in essence, the knowledge isn't developing significantly, but it is something that they're developing in the sense of how Buddhists feel about it and how it affects lives. But if you look at the end of key stage statements, then you can have a look through those things. Would you teach his life first before students know that much about Buddhist life? There's 2 ways of approaching this. So within the pedagogy of RE, you have the phenomenological approach where, yes, you would teach the story, and then you would look at the impact of that story on the life of a Buddhist. The other way is almost the ethnographic approach, which is where you would look at the life of a Buddhist and then teach the story and say, well, how does this link with that? So either way works, but I think the story does have to be used and the story does have to be taught. You can't assume that they already know that story. So we do have to kind of look through that various aspect. Okay. And so the middle way, and this is just very quickly, the middle way, there's 8 specific sections to it: right understanding, right attitude, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right awareness, and right concentration. So there's different ways of doing that. And as a Buddhist lives those principles, then they are on the path to enlightenment. And it can be broken down into 3 ways. So there's the threefold way. So this is where the way of wisdom, prajna, the way of morality, sila, and the way of meditation, samadhi, fall into or have the different aspects of the eightfold path go into them. So prajna, for example, is right understanding and right attitude. The way of morality is right speech, right action, right livelihood. So the way that a Buddhist will earn their living, the way that they will speak to others, and then the way of meditation, which is right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And in essence, the way of morality, certainly within Theravada Buddhism, is focused on the 5 precepts: not taking life, not causing harm, or speaking properly and not telling lies, and different aspects, not taking intoxicants. So there are various aspects of that. And so I think it's important to move then. I think it's really difficult to understand the middle way without understanding the Buddha's life, because he provides the example of that. And so when it comes to, for example, right livelihood, it's not just about not seeking money, it's about finding a job that, yes, meets your needs, but also enables a person to avoid certain extremes within that. So the eightfold path is something that obviously we explore at different stages, and we can explore in different ways. But perhaps in key stage 3, that's where we begin to draw all of them together. In key stage 1, 2, we might be almost talking about them separately. But certainly upper key stage 2, key stage 3, we're bringing them together and saying, well, how does this relate to the Buddha's life? And I think one of the key aspects of Buddhism is the stories that you find within Buddhism, because again, it's debatable. There are other religions that are as focused on stories, and I think storytelling is incredibly important for teaching Buddhist ideals and teaching children to understand Buddhist ideas. And I think I'm going to share just, 4 stories now that will help children understand the first noble truth. And the first one is the story of Krisha Gautami, who her firstborn child died, and she just wanted him to be raised back from the dead. People laughed at her, but then she sought out the Buddha and asked the Buddha to raise him from the dead. So she went to the Buddha, this is the second paragraph that you can see in front of you, and laid the body of her child at his feet and told him her story. The Buddha listened with infinite compassion. Then he said gently, "There is only one way to heal your affliction. Go down to the city and bring me back a mustard seed from any house in which there has never been a death." So then there was hope and in her, but she went to all the different houses and she was unable to find a house where no one had died. And then she took the body of her child to the charnel ground, said goodbye to him for the last time, then returned to the Buddha, who asked, "Did you bring the mustard seed?" "No," she said, "I'm beginning to understand the lesson you're trying to teach me. Grief made me blind, and I thought that only I had suffered at the hands of death. Why have you come back? To ask you to teach me the truth of what death is and what might lie behind and beyond death." And Annika suggested that she's used this, and the students grasped it straight away. And that's, I think, the beauty of the Buddhist stories, but also the Buddhist stories. Now, there are some stories that are suitable for different key stages, but this helps us understand the first noble truths, puts it in a way that children can understand. The second story is almost a narrated story. And it's not one of the Buddhas, but it is a Buddhist story. So one night, 2 children came to a beautiful farmhouse, completely surrounded by piles of wagon wheel. An old couple opened the door and invited them in. They went to look at the wheels more closely, and then saw that behind the farmhouse was a collection of wagons. Have you made them? Yes, we have, but why? For whom? For those who journey on the path of life. Each of these wagons has 4 wheels. The first is the wheel of bodily needs, that is being free from hunger, illness, and cold. The second is the wheel of love, made of 2 halves put together, loving and being loved. The third is the wheel of worldly aims. These are the goals which give a sense of direction to life. The 4th wheel is the wheel of spiritual aims, those beyond the limited reality of this world. Sadly, people pile up their wagons with so many things that they think they need that they end up breaking their wagons and they have to come back for them to be repaired. Can you repair the wheels? Not always. And why do people carry so much? Because they believe they need everything they see or hear about. So this is the idea of craving again. And then towards the end, you must show them that all they pile up on their wagons, although it's very pleasant, is not really what they need. They're the only playthings of life. So this is interesting in the sense that the song isn't packing up your wagon, but in the sense that it's life is to be lived with the things that they need. And so again, this story quite helps. And so having children label the wheels, but then also give examples of things that could be included in the wagon that would meet the needs of the wheels, and where do we stop within those specific concepts. Okay, I'm whiffling on again. So the third noble truth, the fact that there is a solution to suffering, and that is to remove craving. And again, this is a story. A monk in his travels once found a precious stone and kept it. One day he met a traveler, and when the monk opened his bag to share his food with him, the traveler saw the jewel and asked the monk to give it to him. The monk did so happily. The traveler went on his way overjoyed. The precious jewel would give him enough wealth and security for the rest of his life. However, a few days later, he came back in search of the monk, found him and gave back the stone. He begged the monk, now give me something much more precious than this stone, valuable as it is. Give me that which made you able to give it to me. So again, it's about the removal of craving within, or the removal of desire. So the stories are really helpful. Now, in looking for stories, there are the stories, essentially the Sutta Pitaka, which is one of the 3 baskets of the Tripitaka or the Tipitaka, has stories that the Buddha has told and from the Buddha's lives. So they are in there, and so it's interesting to utilize those. Another website that's quite useful is something called Access to Insight. And Access to Insight has Buddhist scriptures on. It's more of a Theravadan site, but it does have various different stories and various scriptures on there that we can use within this. Now, this is a story I use quite regularly. It's found its way into my faith somehow as well. But this is a story of the middle way. And again, it's from the same documentary. It's only about a minute long though. So let me just share this as a story to help children understand the fourth noble. Okay, so again, it's just another story. And I think this just shows that whatever key stage we're using, there are stories within Buddhism that will help us understand. And if we look at skills development within RE, not just knowledge development, we can have children kind of think, well, how does this apply to the life of a Buddhist today? What can we do within that concept? Okay, sorry, Nishin's just asked for me to retell where we can access stories for use in the classroom for Buddhism. There is a website called Access to Insight. I will put it into the chat as well. I think it's accesstoinsight.org. And that it's not the easiest website to navigate, but it does have the scriptures, and it has articles, and it has different things within that for you to access and to have a look at. So have a search around that. There's also Clear Vision. I'll also write that within here. So if you Google Clear Vision Buddhism, that comes from a particular tradition, but they generally are accepted by all Buddhists, the stories that are told there. Oops, move on. So moving on, just to look at the 3 marks of existence, because I think these are important to help us understand, as teachers, the Buddhist worldview. And so there's anatta, the denial of a permanent personal self or soul; anicca, which is impermanence, the instability of all things; and then dukkha, suffering, which is the nature of human existence. And this is perhaps some of the things that differentiate Buddhism from other religious traditions, and has a knock-on effect when it comes to look at issues with regards to life and death. So with regards to anatta, which is the denial of the permanent self or soul, there is a story in the Questions of King Milinda, and there is a story about a chariot. And so within Buddhism, there is something called khandhas or skandhas, depending on which transliteration that we're using. And it's about 5 lines down. And so humans are made up of 5 khandhas. And those 5 khandhas we'll look at in just one moment. But essentially, those are the various aspects of a human being. But just as, and this is in the scriptures, just as a chariot is on the pole, the axle, the wheels, the framework, the flagstaff, that there takes place this denomination chariot, this designation, this conceptual term, a current, appellation, and a mere name. And then it carries on down at the bottom. Your Majesty has spoken well about the chariot. It is just so with me. Independence and the 32 parts of the body and the 5 khandhas, there takes this denomination nagasena, this designation. And so humans have 5 khandhas, which make themselves up. So looking at them, and this is the example of a snake, they work together to provide or produce personal experience. For example, if a person was taking a walk in the garden, their eyes might come into contact with an object. They would focus their attention on the object. Their consciousness becomes aware. Their perception then identifies what the visible object is. The person then experiences a feeling, and then they respond to the snake with mental formation, with the intentional action of running away. So everything is dependent on these 5 different parts of a human. But at death, they just all break up. Just as the axle, the wheel, and the flagstaff all break up from a chariot, then so too with a human. There is no soul, there is no spirit that passes. So within Hinduism, the belief in reincarnation is fairly straightforward to explain to children, because it's the idea that there is a soul or an Atman within everybody that passes from one living thing to the next. And that makes sense. And the karma that a person or a being accumulates is then passed forward into the next being. Whereas within Buddhism, the way that life after death and rebirth is explained is that one candle is blown out and another candle is lit. And so the karmic consequences kind of move on from being to being, but it's incredibly difficult to explain, because the way we want to explain it as teachers, I think, is by using the analogy of almost a soul passing from one to the next. But to talk about the soul or the spirit is incorrect when we come to talk about Buddhism. And so it's really complex. And so life after death and answers to life, some of life's big questions like creation and life after death, are difficult to explore with children. So we have to, I'm not really providing an answer to this, because although I have a fairly decent understanding of Buddhism, I still struggle with the concept of life after death and this idea of one candle being blown out and another candle being lit, and how the karmic energy passes from one to the next. But maybe that's all there is to explain. But then we use the wheel of life. Now, this is really interesting, because we will often use this in a classroom, or the wheel of existence. Yeah, the wheel of existence. And we'll use this within a classroom to explain what we mean, or what Buddhists believe about rebirth, and that there are different realms of rebirth. So there's the realms of the hungry ghosts, for example, who are always eating and can never be satisfied. Or there's the realm of the gods, where people, or where gods just are so happy with where they are and what they're doing that they have no desire to escape the cycle of rebirth and everything else, and that the best realm to be in is that of a human. Ellie explains she understood it more as the passing of a flame from one candle to another, i.e. then the first candle is blown out after the first one has been lit. And I think that is an interpretation of them. I think the way I was taught it, and perhaps because I've not gone down a hugely significant route with regards to it, because I couldn't get my head around it, was that one is blown out as another one is lit. But it's easier to understand if we use your analogy, so I will look more into that. Now, the problem with this wheel is that it's Mahayanan. And the reason we can tell it is Mahayanan, sorry, I'll click over that, is the existence here of a Bodhisattva in each of the different realms. So I've just highlighted one in the picture. But this wheel is useful and important, because if I go back, there are various different explanations. Don't try and scribble all these down, I will make it available. So the wheel is driven because of the three poisons, desire, hatred, and ignorance, represented by three animals in the middle. So we will see those right in the middle that kind of drive this. So there are important truths that are taught within the wheel of life and the wheel of existence. But the problem is, it's a Mahayanan view. And sometimes what we do is we move from teaching about Buddhism, and we'll say, okay, and this is what Buddhists believe about life after death, without making clear that actually Theravadins would have a huge issue with the way that this depicts life after death and the realms of reality and everything else, especially with the concept of the Bodhisattva, which you would find. Now, some explanations, and I think I've even found a worksheet I used to use that said there is a Buddha in each of these different realms that helps people out. But actually it's with regards to a Bodhisattva with Mahayanan. And then this whole wheel is held in the hands of the demon Yama. So the concept of there being a God and kind of the supernatural is also there. But we present this as though this is kind of the Buddhist answer to it. And I think it's important when we teach about the wheel of life, that yes, we teach about the symbolism that we find within it, but also that there's a diversity of understanding within it. And I think not the biggest difference, one of the main differences between Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism is the ideal that they have of bodhisattvas as opposed to the Buddha himself. So Leanne suggests that GCSE she teaches this in Mahayana. Yeah, I'm making huge generalizations today, so I apologize for that. With Theravada Buddhism, for the most part, the focus is on the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama. However, within Mahayana, there are many, many different bodhisattvas. And these are people or beings who have put off enlightenment to help other people find enlightenment. So they have stopped their own parinibbana because they want to come back. And so the Dalai Lama, for example, is an example of a living bodhisattva who has come to help people. And he has suggested in different times and places whether he may be the last manifestation of the particular bodhisattva that he is. And so there's two different ideals. There's the Arahant or the Arhat ideal and the Bodhisattva ideal. And within Theravada Buddhism, which is the Arahant or the Arhat ideal, essentially enlightenment is only available to monks and potentially nuns, depending on which view that we look at. And so Buddhists can gain merit by making offerings to them, but you have to renounce the world to achieve Nibbana. So the life of a Buddhist monk within Theravada is incredibly key. And the life of the Buddhist monk is determined and guided by one of the three aspects of the Pali Canon, the Tipitaka, which is the Vinaya Pitaka. And so those control, I think it's 227 rules, I think, off the top of my head, that a Buddhist monk should follow. And that, so there is very much a split between the laity and the ordained Sangha. But within Mahayana, there is this concept of the Bodhisattva. So everybody has a Buddha nature within them. And they have the potential to reach enlightenment. But a more worthy goal, a more compassionate goal than a personal enlightenment is to be able to stop and help others. And this is very much based on the Lotus Sutra that we may come across. And so this is important, because when we look at, and children will come in, children will come into school and they'll say, okay, we've seen this statue and it doesn't look like the ones that we've been looking at. It looks like this. And we have to perhaps recognize that there are different ways of approaching Bodhisattva or the Buddha or other things that are there. So we have to kind of just recognize there is this diversity that is taking place within Buddhism as a whole. And so having children understand that there's possibly more than one representation of different people or different beings that can form a part of worship is important. And so we have to recognize. Now, obviously, probably the most well-known is of the Japanese fat Buddha, who actually isn't a Buddha at all and is just a monk that is known to bring good luck, a bit like I saw described as a bit like Santa Claus within Christianity. So kind of almost a mythical figure, so to speak, but not a Bodhisattva or a Buddhist, which just raises another level of complexity within it. And so we teach these kind of two ideals that are there and recognize. Now, even in teaching that, there are potentially different precepts. But generally speaking, we teach the 5 precepts. The first 5 precepts are the first 5 pansals from Theravada, which are refrain from killing living things, refraining from stealing, unchastity, and lying, and taking intoxicants. So, but a monk will live, or a nun will live all 10 of those. And whereas the Bodhisattva precepts are slightly different, but they would still build on the things that we see within the 10 pansals. Now, Megan asks the question, would there be merit in referring to Siddhartha as the historical Buddha? I think potentially not, because if we use that phrase, we're suggesting that the others may not be historical or may not be real. And I think Mahayana Buddhists would tend to understand them as being real and actually historical figures themselves. And so I would always differentiate between the Buddha and a Bodhisattva. And although they are kind of similar in that sense, it's just easier to maintain that kind of difference. But they are people who have put off that enlightenment, that final enlightenment that are there. Now, interestingly, there's a man called Walpole Rahula. He's mentioned on at least one of the A-level specifications. And he suggests that actually the idea of a bodhisattva can also be found in Theravada as well. So everything that I've just told you, he would say, well, maybe not, because there's 3 different ways. There's the way of the Arahant, the way of the disciple, so living the life the way that the Buddha does. The 3rd path is the way of the Bodhisattva, and most Theravadins would not live that, is his argument. And then the 2nd is the path of the lone Buddha, so someone who's reached enlightenment without knowing about the Buddha. So there are those 3 different things, but I think that's potentially too complex to include in any of our teaching. Oh, wrong way. So then, how do Buddhists express their belief? And there are 3 different forms of meditation that I think are used by Buddhists. And sometimes it's quite confusing. So dhyana is a catch-all term for meditation, but it is also a specific method. So quieting mind, sitting in certain positions, and this is kind of the most basic of the meditative features. And it moves on to then something which is samatha meditation, where people will use certain things such as a Buddha Rupa or a candle flame, or focusing on one specific thing to enable them to detach and to find a calm and peaceful consciousness. Now, samatha is not something as a meditation that leads directly to enlightenment. It leads actually to the final stage of meditation, which is vipassana. Okay, and we'll come to vipassana in a moment, but this is an example of a shrine where people will use the different objects. And one of the things that we can explore are the different statues of the Buddha himself in different positions, in different ways that are symbolizing different things. And so looking at the way a Buddhist will use the statues of the Buddha to focus on different aspects of his characteristics and different aspects of his life is important at the various stages that we will look at. But vipassana is kind of the final insight meditation, and this is the kind of meditation that will lead to enlightenment within most forms of Buddhism. There is a different form within Zen, but we won't explore that today. And so vipassana is usually taught by a master, and it's used to internalize the Dharma and lead to enlightenment. So even meditation has different forms and is done for different purposes. Some is just used to kind of deal with the issues that we face in everyday lives. Others are used as a specific approach towards enlightenment. So one of the things that we have to kind of battle, and battle is the right word, one of the things we have to overcome when we teach Buddhism is an idealistic view of it. When I was doing some writing about the concept of violence and the concept of war and armed service within Buddhism, I got criticized. I got a letter back saying, no, there's no diversity. All Buddhists are pacifists. And this is the view that the kind of Buddhists are just chill, essentially. And without making this a huge focus, we have to recognize that the idealistic view that we have of Buddhism is wrong. Yes, it is right, but it's not all there is to know about Buddhism. Now, I was going to show you, I'll show you a short clip, which is from Lisa Becomes a Buddhist. There's all kinds of things wrong, and I think it would be an interesting task to show this to children and ask them to highlight the things that are wrong, not least the statue of the Buddha that they're actually sat in front of. What we sometimes do is, again, just going back to the chocolate box, is we kind of teach, well, this is the way that a Buddhist will live, but there's actually different things. Now, the picture on the left, just highlights something for me that's a regret. I was once walking down the street in London and saw a Buddhist monk with a selfie stick. I thought, but there is no self. And so it's just interesting to see that there are different ways that Buddhists live. And then there's also on the right-hand side, what is described by Time magazine as a Buddhist terrorist, which seems kind of an oxymoron. And I'm not suggesting that we use those extremes, but these extremes are an interesting way for us to understand that Buddhists are not all chill and everything else. There are different expressions of who and what Buddhism means to people. And I think this is most exemplified in Aung San Suu Kyi. So she can be found on some GCSE specifications. To give her due, she has never proclaimed herself to be a saint or to be anything other than who she is. And the top quote, "I'm just a politician, I'm not quite like Margaret Thatcher, no, but on the other hand, I'm no Mother Teresa either. I've never said that I was." And so we have this woman who was living by Buddhist principles and was seen to be an exemplar of Buddhist teachings. And it was just highlighted throughout that how amazing she was and what a great example she was of Buddhist principles. And then we fast forward a few years, and this is what this article suggests. We fast forward a few years, and actually the way that the Rohingya are viewed within Myanmar, perhaps she has some responsibility to face for that. And so, but essentially she just highlights the fact that there are problems with what a Buddhist does. And just as there are problems with what a Christian does and how a Christian lives their life, we can't just pigeonhole Buddhism. And so I think that's an important aspect of what we do. Now, I've talked an awful lot, and there's all kinds of stuff that's gone on. This is an example of Norfolk's agreed syllabus and how they suggest that RE, or the concepts in Buddhism, are developed over the course of the 3 key stages. So there are those examples that we can look at, but there's different ways that we can structure progression within Buddhism as a whole. Okay, so I've whiffled on for a very long time, so I do apologize for that, but we've kind of talked just as a general introduction to Buddhism. Hopefully it's been useful, or that's certainly been the plan. But if you have any final questions, I'll leave this up. So if you can scribble down that address, there is a certificate. There is a certificate that's available for you. You will need that password, which is James CPD, once you click on it. So thank you very much. If there's any final questions, I'm happy to stick around and take them, but it's just been kind of chatting on. Sharon, if you wish to unmute yourself and have a chat, you're most welcome to. I know you've just raised a hand, I think. So Gemma asks a question, would you advise teaching about diversity very early on? I've just lost it. To avoid overgeneralization. Depends on what key stage. I think in key stage 1 and 2, what's most important is we use the words most, many, and some. I think upper key stage 2, key stage 3, I think it's important to help children understand that there are a diversity of views and where they will be going on. So I think the diversity is important. Okay, someone's just asked a question. Sorry. Your pronunciation during this has been excellent. Do you have any resources finding out how to pronounce Buddhist keywords? Okay, so there's 2 sources. About 20 years ago, QCA published a document, which is a glossary of terms that has how to pronounce. So we can use that, and that should be available on the internet. The other thing is RE definitions. It's an app or a website that does have how you pronounce those things. The other thing to do with that, if you're unsure, is just say it loud and proud, and hopefully no one will disagree, and just go with that and see how people cope. And if you're corrected, then that's fine. Other questions? Will I be emailing regarding future CPD? Yes, if you've emailed me and I've got your email, then I will send a kind of blind copied email with future CPD on it. So yes, I will do that. Keep an eye on Twitter as well, because I'll always post things on there. So thank you very much indeed for your attendance. If you can fill in the evaluation and then get your look out for the link at the end, and then you can get your certificate that says that you've done this. That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for taking so much time out to come and visit with me. Okay, thank you again.